Hello, and welcome back. Welcome back to our online confirmation class. This week we are going to discuss Noah, Noah and the flood. So that's why I got my, I don't know, my version of a Hawaiian shirt. Um, some tropical plants on it. Anyway, um, so this is an interesting story. Again, it's at the beginning of the Bible. We'll see, as we talk about this in class, how the Bible moves from a big overview um, of God and the world, and then it narrows it down. Like next week when we talk about Abraham and Sarah, it narrows it down to the family of Abraham, from whom the Israelites come from, and then the story of God with the Israelites. But as they tell their story, they start out with this bigger panoramic view of God creating the world, God creating the first people, and how evil came into the world. And God, and there's a long list before we get to, because the story of Noah is in chapter 6. So in chapter 5, it's just a long list of the descendants between Adam and Noah. And, there's a bunch of people with names that we can't pronounce. The interesting thing in there is that the length of years that people lived, 895, 969, 777. One interesting person is the person of Enoch, who after 365 years, it says, that's what it says about Enoch. He said he lived 65 years and became the father of Methuselah. Now Enoch walked with God after the birth of Methuselah for 300 years and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Enoch were 365 years. Enoch walked with God, and then he was no more, because God took him. And so you have in here this idea that Enoch didn't die, that God took him right to heaven, right with him, because of the type of person he was. Anyway, Enoch was like the great grandfather of Noah. But there's a lot of years in between, because Methuselah was the one that lived for almost 1,000 years. He was 187 when he had his first kid. And Lamech, who was Noah's father, was 182 when he had Noah. It's kind of crazy, these years. Noah himself was 500 years old before he had his first son. And then he had 3 of them: Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now those 3, when they do some genealogy, we see who all descended from them. But to get to Noah and the flood, all during this time, people have been doing what God told them to do. They had been multiplying. And, the sons of Cain, as I said, brought civilization, and they learned how to do metalwork, and they brought music and fire. They did good things, they did bad things. They were being people. But that's not why the flood. The flood happened because God said, in our Bible it says, when people began to multiply on the face of the ground, and daughters were born to them. The sons of God saw that they were fair. So these sons of God are angels. Angels, saw that the daughters of men were fair and beautiful, and they took wives for them. Now God saw this happening. And he said, this isn't right. Angels should not mate with mortals. And so then he put a limit on them on how old they would live, which would be 120 years. And so the offspring of the angels and the humans were called Nephilim. And of course it says that these were the heroes of old, the warriors of renown. They were giants. And then it also says the Lord saw that the wickedness of humankind was great in the earth and in our hearts. That every inclination was only evil. And so God decided he would destroy the earth and he would start over. He wouldn't start from the very beginning because he still wanted to use the earth, but he would start with new people. But there was Noah. And Noah had found favor in the sight of the Lord. He was a righteous man, he was blameless, and he walked with God. And so God gave him a job. God told him to build an ark. Build an ark. Build a boat. And I am going to send to you, God says, I'm going to send to you all the creatures of the earth so that you can put them in the ark and they can survive this flood that I'm going to bring upon the earth. Now here's the interesting thing about floods and flood stories. Is every religion, well, maybe I shouldn't say every religion, just about every religion in the world has a flood story. That somewhere in the beginnings of time, there was a flood. And usually it was to wash everything clean and create new things. Now, why do they have these stories? Well, we live in South Dakota. You can go out to the Black Hills and you can go, walk around in the hills on the top of those mountains and you can find fossils of shells of sea animals. You find those at every mountain in the world. Why? Because of the flood. I mean, the people who lived and created, the stories that we follow for the various religions, they had to describe and come to terms with the world around them. They didn't know about tectonic plates. They didn't know about the movement of the earth underneath us. They knew about earthquakes. They knew about volcanoes. And they knew a lot of things, but they really didn't know about the expanse of time that the earth was around. They didn't know at one time this whole area where we're living in was an underground sea. And then when there was great upheaval, the Rocky Mountains were pushed up. The Black Hills came up. the ice came down from the north in the ice ages. They have some faint memories of these events if they happened during when humans were alive, like the ice age, but not the upheaval of the mountains. You know from your class about on geography that the Rocky Mountains are a lot newer than the Appalachian Mountains in the east. And you can see that time has had a different effect on them. Because they're newer, they're still rugged, they're still tall. Whereas in the Appalachian Mountains, they're lower, they're rounded, wind and rain has had time to work on them. But you go up in the mountains and you find fossils. How did those fossils get there? Well, one time the water had to be that high. So there was a flood. I'm going to ask you here, you kind of know this story of Noah and the flood. How many animals, how many of each animal did Noah have in the ark? If you go to in chapter 7 of your Bible, you'll find the answer. But most of the time we say 2, right? Male and a female of every animal. But if you look in the Bible, it actually says, take with you 7 pairs of all the clean animals. So that's 14 of the clean animals. And 1 pair of the unclean animals. 7 pairs of the birds of the air. So that would have been a lot of animals that Noah built. And as he built this ark, there were people around him and they laughed at him and they made fun of him. They thought he was a little woohoo. Why are you building this ark? Why are you building a boat here where there's no water? Crazy as a loon. You can go out to by Cincinnati. Somebody made a replica of the ark using the measurements that are in the Bible, so you can get a fairly good look at what the size of that boat is. So it's a big boat, but I think our cruise ships are bigger. And can you imagine some of the animals that we have in a boat? Rhinoceroses and elephants and giraffes, hippopotamuses. Those are big animals. Take up a lot of space. Anyway, God told Noah it's going to flood the earth. He told Noah to build this ark. And to make sure that there is space on there for him and his family. Because just as God was saving all the animals and the birds of the air, because the fish could fend for themselves, to repopulate the earth so he didn't have to start from scratch, Noah and his family would repopulate the earth with people. And so the flood came. And for 40 days and for 40 nights, the waters poured down. The earth was flooded. And then after that, like it said, he sailed on the earth for 150 days. So after the 40 days and 40 nights of rain, there was still another 5 months. of sailing around in circles, sailing around the earth. Another 5 months in the boat till God put out a wind to start to dry the water. And eventually they receded enough and it was the 7th month on the 17th day of the month that the ark finally came to rest on the top of a mountain. So 7 months, 7.5 months, they were cooped up in that boat. And then 40 days later, Noah sent out a raven. But there was no place for the raven to land, so it returned. And then he sent out a dove after that, and the dove returned. And then he sent out another dove a week later. And the dove came back with a brand new olive leaf. So the earth had dried up, the plants had started to come back. And when that happened, another week later, he sent out the dove again. This time it did not return. And so, it says in the 601st year, in the 1st month, on the 1st day of the month. So Noah's 600 years old. He opens the ark and releases the animals. And God, after he released the animals, Noah built an altar to the Lord, and it's a good thing that the Lord gave him, 7 pairs of every animal, because Noah took one of every clean animal and every clean bird, and he offered an offering to God on that altar. And that's when we hear the promise. I will never again curse the ground because of humankind. For the inclination of the human heart is evil from youth, nor will I ever again destroy every living creature as I have done. As long as the earth endures, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. And then he made the rainbow. It says, I establish my covenant with you and your descendants and every living creature, birds, animals. I establish my covenant with you that never again shall all flesh be cut off from the waters of a flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. And this is the sign. I have set my bow in the clouds, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. So the rainbow is that sign. The sign that God says he will never destroy the earth again with water. But it's the sign of promise. And again, during that whole time that they were on the boat, the whole time that the world was being flooded, they were not alone. God was with them. And of course, we find out at the end of the story, Noah, first thing he does once all the animals are gone and God has made that promise is he plants a vineyard. and he makes wine, and he gets drunk. And he passes out naked. And of course, the boys find him, and one tells the other, and of course, you know, they come in and they cover up their dad. But that's what happens with Noah. And he lived another 350 years after the flood. So he was 950 years when he died. It's like his grandpa, almost 1,000. And of course, then it tells, the next stories tell of which nations, which people are descended from Noah and his sons. And we see the story of the Tower of Babel, which tells us why there are so many different languages in the world. And we move through, again, we get a list of people. So-and-so is the father of this person, who's father of this person, who's the father of this person, all the way down till we get to Abram, who becomes Abraham, who becomes the father of the Israelites. That will be our next story. So Noah, as we said, kind of an interesting story of him being the only righteous person, the only person that really listens and still follows God and talks with God, walks with God, and so he is saved. So, you know, I had like a small running argument with somebody that, you know, always talked about that. They always said we were descended from Noah because of the flood. Of course, I said, well, we're descended from Adam. And they're like, no. But because of the flood, it's Noah. And I'm like, well, but Noah's a descendant of Adam. Anyway, trivial stuff that people argue about. So I just have a couple questions for you to think about as we come to the end of our conversation here about Noah. One question: what would you do? What would you do if God asked you to do something that was just completely crazy? Completely crazy. And you know that if you do it, people would make fun of you. They would call you loony. They might not want to talk to you. What would you do in that case? Would you listen to God? Or did you listen to the other people that are telling you you're crazy? And the other question is, what would you have done after you walked out of the door of that ark? What would it be like to step off the ark after being there for over 5 months, taking care of actually it was 7 months, um, taking care of your family and all the animals, and you're finally able to set free on the ground. What would you do? What's the first thing you would do? What's the second? What kind of life would you rebuild for yourself and for your family? Just think about that. What would you have done during the time that you were on the ark? How would you have passed that time? Another thing to think about. Well, anyway, that's our little video on Noah, the one who was righteous, the only one in the world that still walked with God, the only one in the world that believed. Believed enough to do a crazy thing. Crazy thing that saved us all. Well, hopefully I see you in class next week, but until then, have a blessed week. Bye.